Hello, and good afternoon, and welcome to the April installment of the third season of the Religion and series, co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. The goal of this series is to create a space for thoughtful and engaged conversation at the intersection of religion and American studies. In these times, we need safe harbors to engage and unpack questions about the relationship between culture and transformation in North America and the category of religion. For the last 33 years, the Center, its journal, and the Young Scholar program has been just that. It has brought together scholars and practitioners to think deeply about religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our field, on our campuses, and throughout our society. The Religion and series was created with the same goal in mind, to facilitate conversations among leading academics and thinkers who are making critically important interventions. Every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, we discuss a topic that looks at the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our days, and their impact on the fields we study. Today, we will discuss the theme of religion and drugs, motivated by a variety of factors, including sympathetic legal decisions, clinical research, and the larger psychedelic renaissance. Research suggests that the religious use of psychoactive substances is not only increasing, but increasing rapidly. Among other things, people are forming churches and informal groups, they're advertising their ceremonies, and they're sponsoring conferences espousing the virtues of religious drug use. This panel will explore these themes and more. Because our event today is focused on conversation, we want to hear your questions. Please share them, but please submit your questions through the Q&A feature rather than the chat. Let me begin by introducing our panel for today's discussion in alphabetical order. Gary Laderman is Goodrich C. White Professor of American Religious History and Cultures at Emory University. Andrew Monteith is Assistant Professor and Distinguished Emerging Scholar of Religious Studies at Elon University. His book, Christian Nationalism and the Birth of the War on Drugs, comes out with NYU Press in July. Finally, Deepak Sharma is Inaugural Distinguished Scholar in the Public Humanities at Case Western Reserve University. So we will begin with the following question. To talk about the religious use of psychoactive substances is to enter a taxonomic quagmire of sorts, as the communities that consume these substances have different preferred terms referencing or distinguishing the religious use of these substances. These terms include, among others, psychedelics, plant medicines, sacraments, and entheogens. For better or worse, the term entheogen has become the dominant term referencing the religious use of psychoactive substances. So for people who aren't familiar with it, Deepak, can you please introduce this word?
Yeah, absolutely. So the word entheogen really refers to the God within, and it's the term that's used to describe the kind of spiritual experience that a consumer of the substance will have, a consumer of the entheogen would have. And it's such a problematic sort of category because it suggests that the substances, the molecules have as their end product a spiritual experience. And it really kind of limits and focuses things in that way. And surely these substances can be used for other purposes, right? So in the kind of the taxonomy of it, it delineates and circumscribes what the intended effect or impact of the substance should be. And here it should be an entheogen. It should kind of refer to the God within or some kind of spiritual experience that one has or religious experience that one has. So if we think about the set and the setting, it biases the set and setting to make sure that it's a spiritual or religious one. So very problematic, but interesting.
I'm curious, is there a term that you prefer instead? Like if you're describing these kinds of events to students in your classes, how would you actually describe it?
I think that I like the word psychedelic the most because I think I think that if we are to accept that all of these terms are humanly constructed and biased, the one that psychedelic seems to be the one that is the broadest or the least biased in a way. So I tend to use that because once you start using the word religion, or then you also have to worry about the creation of the term religion and thinking in terms of people like J.Z. Smith and all of that.
Gary, it looks like you're talking, but you are muted.
Yeah, it looks like sure, thanks. It's great to be here, by the way, with this group. So really appreciate the invitation. But just quickly, I think it can be useful for sure as a neologism, as a psychedelic, you know, these words that we're creating to try to capture an experience that are sort of historically situated. And that also, you know, as Deepak was saying, kind of have a lot of baggage. And I prefer to stay away from entheogen myself, and I'm in the camp, in the psychedelic camp, as far as that goes, you know. But again, when you think about drugs as a larger category, psychedelics and entheogens are just one component.
Mm-hmm. We already have one question, not to just start answering the questions now, but someone was asking about the specific history of this term, which I think is germane to the question. Does someone want to tackle it? Who invented this term? Where? When?
You know, I think I've got Chris Partridge's book on my desk, and I feel like he actually answers this exact question somewhere in the beginning.
I can dive in if you'd like.
Yeah.
So, Professor Carl Ruck in 1978 was talking to Jonathan Ott and a couple other psychedelic activists, and they wanted a term to distinguish. They thought it would be disrespectful to refer to psychedelic religion, like referring to the Catholic communion as psychedelic, that the term had too much cultural baggage from the 1960s. So they wanted to distinguish the religious or the sacramental use of psychoactive substances from the recreational use. And so Carl Ruck, being a professor from Boston University, a professor of classics, looked back at the so-called Western classics and saw this term entheos and combined it with hallucinogen to create entheogen. And so this is the history of the term, created in 1978 to deliberately reference the religious use of psychoactive substances. So if we can ask a second question here, what psychoactive substances are people consuming for religious reasons? Gary, you want to field this one?
Sure, I don't think I'm muted. All of them. That's where I'm going. That's what I'm thinking, is psychoactive substances are very often and commonly connected with the religious life and different aspects of not just religious experience, but sort of religious cultural expression. So I'm interested in everything from coffee to chocolate, alcohol, of course, tobacco. These things have deep and rich histories that connect them to spirituality and religion, but I don't think they lose some of that sacred quality in the more sort of modern capitalist contemporary society. So cannabis as well, all of these can start any number of great conversations. The one I'm particularly interested in, that I find that at least I haven't yet found people within religious studies really focusing in on and trying to explore, of course, is pharmaceuticals and prescription drugs. I think those have a great deal to say about contemporary religious life.
And I think in some ways, Gary's answer bounces almost back to the previous one, because I was about to respond maybe to the split between recreation and religion, because I find that split actually kind of problematic. Like, we've got this thing over here and this is fun. And as soon as it starts being fun, it's no longer religion. Like, so religion by definition can't be recreational. Like, that split, I think, sets us up to think about these categories in ways where, once we start talking about recreational substances, it becomes a way to dismiss something as not really religion or not really, spiritual, whichever word. Those words are, just as problematic here as some of the other terms. But I'm thinking here about which substances actually get used for religion, as Gary's, addressing. What is it we're trying to track with religion? And I think I'd not thought of pharmaceuticals in this context before, but I think Gary's right to point to this, because if we're thinking about maybe well-being or I don't know, like a sense of maybe of not getting by. I hate this word. Like, I'm setting myself up here to fall into the trap of saying religion's about comfort, which is not my argument. I don't want to go down that road. But the sense that there may actually be something to being well that fits within whatever it is we're calling religion. And so to that extent, I mean, I hadn't thought of pharmaceuticals in this context, but I'm really interested to hear more about this, Gary. Like, where's your mind going when you say that this is something you're thinking about?
We could take a long time, but very quickly, just what you're saying. Thinking about what I consider to be a religious culture, a religious culture that's operating, that is tied into mythology, that is tied into ritual. A part of my take, which is certainly shaped by Kathy Albanese from Santa Barbara, is when we talk about religion, we can talk about mystical, extraordinary experiences, or the more ordinary kind of security and stability that religion and ritual can bring. So just think about the ritual of taking the pill every morning. The mythology of the marketing all speak to a certain kind of religious sensibility around identity, around transcendence, around suffering, that again, isn't tied into Protestantism necessarily, or Judaism or Hinduism, but has its own, again, sort of religious quality. When I bring this up, people get pissed off or they don't get it. And I don't know, that's part of our deal, is to surface up the ways in which people are being religious that they might not recognize.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, clearly acid, LSD began as a pharmaceutical. I mean, Sandoz made it as a pharmaceutical, and things like even DMT was formulated and was intended for some pharmaceutical intent. And something like ketamine, without a doubt, is a pharmaceutical that now has morphed over into something else. So I think that when we think about something as being a pharmaceutical and when does it move on to something else, I mean, these are all very, very fluid sorts of categories, very fluid categories. It's interesting that they went from pharmaceutical to Schedule I, and now they're back to pharmaceutical and so many other things.
And it's almost a question of motive, right? I mean, why are you using the substance? Is it for fun? Is it for medicine? Is it religious? Like, that question of motive itself has like that whole maybe sincerity question behind it. Are you really genuine about your reasons for using this?
It's interesting. It's funny that the kind of some of the worlds that I've observed, that people frame that in terms of intention, which is different from motive, right? And I wonder what that difference is, motive and intention. Motive seems a little bit more suspicious, right? Intention seems a little bit more intentional. But you're right, like, which intentions are appropriate? But for that matter, even if you intend something to be therapeutic, it could also have religious effects and so on. So I think that on the other hand, when we look at how it's being used in the allopathic setting, there is sometimes some intention to make sure that there's no spiritual consequence and that it should only be therapeutic, right? So I know Hopkins is trying to deal with that, but it's complicated, shall we say?
And so, do you have in mind here like the THC content of marijuana? Like, if we're going to use marijuana medically, we want to make sure people don't get high. We'll breed a strain that doesn't get you high. I mean, I've heard this discussion, but it's not a line I've chased.
I have never thought about that.
Yeah, I think my mind is going here to peyote, because if we're trying to talk about this split between what's medicine and what's religion, peyote does not really, like, it's really hard to split that. It starts as both, and it's used as both. And there's not this, in its original context, there's not that split where you have to pick one or the other. And if you're doing one, you're not doing the other. And some people maybe gravitate more towards one. And if you look at the early records about, when peyote is starting to expand around the turn of the century, people are using it in all sorts of ways. There's not some single form that everything takes. Some people seem to be thinking about it, this is a solution to some medical issue. And some people do seem to be using it more for what we would think of as religion, but there's not some way to describe everybody at once. And even those individuals aren't necessarily making those splits except in rare moments. So I don't know. I mean, I don't want to keep eating up the time. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's a critical point, and one that you inevitably comes up, you know, as you explore the question of drugs and religion, is this overlap between medicinal and spiritual purposes, and as you were saying earlier, even recreational. Those boundaries, you know, I'm a historian, I don't know, but especially if you think historically and cross-culturally, you know, the categories get more and more shaky. And you have to accept this incredible diversity of intentions. I'm not so interested in intention and motivation. That's too like psychological. I mean, these are part of symptomatic, and these are symptoms of larger sort of cultural and social patterns that again are tied into certain kinds of religious cultural movements and valences.
If I could just add, I think that this question about pharmaceutical and spiritual, that so many of the studies in allopathic contexts are funded by pharmaceutical companies, and they want to make it pharmaceutical, right? And and without a doubt, I think Poland, as much as I love Poland and think that he did something good, he also made it validated kind of pharmaceutical kind of orientations and made it more acceptable to the masses. Like people are very happy. Oh, it's pharmaceutical. It's going to address some medical issue. And I think that if we look at this part of the kind of larger healthcare pharmaceutical industrial complex, then it becomes really messy. What to do?
Totally, and I mean, as you alluded to earlier, like the history of pharmacies and pharmaceuticals is rich, especially for people who are interested in religion. I mean, I think there are all kinds of important elements that are there and that are a part of it. But this is also, you begin to see these repetitive cycles of the miracle drug that comes. I mean, early in the 20th century, it was amphetamine. You know, read the history of amphetamine. So there's a great book called On Speed, the many lives of amphetamine, that just, even though he's not a religious historian, it is dripping with religious meanings and connections. So, you know, this is part of a cycle that's tied to the pharmaceutical industry, which is where we place our faith.
So a lot of these substances that people are using for religious reasons today, most of them used to be legal. How have laws changed, and how do these laws impact? And how do these laws impact people and communities today? Andrew, will you field that?
So it's $1 million question, and I think it depends how far back you want us to go, how we answer that. I think my immediate instinct, I do think law is important, but I'm also, I think, interested in Foucault's arguments about power and how it works. And for him, it's not necessarily centered in law. I mean, there's so many other ways this gets institutionalized. And we've been talking here about pharmaceuticals and the medical complex. I mean, this is really a major site for the negotiation of what you can and can't have. But in terms of the laws, I mean, if we're looking back maybe 150 years ago, when most of this is legal. I mean, some of this is coming up for racist reasons. I mean, the first drug laws in the US are passed specifically against opium smoking in San Francisco. They're deliberately targeting the kind of opium that Chinese immigrants were using in the 1870s in San Francisco. The forms that white folks were using didn't get touched until much later. Well, till a little later. But I mean, this movement is partly coming out. I mean, if we're talking about a drug war as like a kind of legal entity that is in many ways coming out of Christian temperance, and for the exact same reasons. If we go back to the 1820s or 1830s, they're talking about opium and tobacco and alcohol all in the same paragraphs. I mean, these are substances that they want to get out of society, because in order for them to build the kingdom of God so Jesus returns, we have to make society look like the kingdom of God. And so by creating the conditions in which the kind of trans Protestant versions of of what a perfect world looks like. In order to get that done, we have to get rid of substance use. And so in that, there's all these different directions that our drug laws started to coalesce around. I mean, a lot of it comes out of colonialism. So if you look at even alcohol, like it's forbidden for American Indians before we ever see actual temperance laws that are like broader. If we look at opium or I'll just stick with opium. That is primarily happening in, I want to say the Philippines is where I would start if I'm trying to figure out how Americans start thinking about legislating this. It's this Episcopalian bishop named Charles Henry Brent is in the Philippines. He's writing on this kind of missionary, we're going to save the world through social programs model. And he writes Roosevelt and says, hey, look, opium is a threat here to our work. And Theodore Roosevelt says, I agree with you, let's do something about it. And we get this series of international treaties where the US is kind of wrangling these other colonial powers and backing them into corners where basically this is how we start to get the international laws, which maybe counterintuitively are where a lot of the domestic stuff gets started. Because in order to honor the treaties we've signed with European powers, we have to then make our own laws that honor those treaties. So I mean, that's a big part of it. But in terms of how those laws affect people, I mean, the drug war as it exists in the 60s onward really has a prison count that could be measured in bodies. Like that has affected people in ways probably, maybe Deepak or Gary will disagree with me, but I don't know if there has been another legal strategy or program that has put more people in prison than the drug war. This to me feels like ground zero for mass incarceration, which is its own kind of commercial product. I'm gonna pause so other people can speak. I tend to keep going if I don't stop myself.
Yeah, and certainly the mass incarceration has racist elements to it, and that you're going to teach a course on drugs and religion or write a book on drugs and religion. This is a central thread, as you're saying, because it goes beyond sort of the legal or the political to what you write about in your book, which looks great and reads great. Is this sort of the religious roots, so to speak, of some of this that does tie into notions of white supremacy, Christian nationalism. This is an integral part of it in America, but the larger picture also, as you were referring to, I don't know, from Columbus on, or I don't know, where you draw the line, but it really also begins, that is, the use of drugs, our relationship to drugs and the modern world is all intricately and connected with hierarchies of power and the oppression of peoples. So I find that interesting. Another angle into the drugs and religion, or maybe later, is also thinking about addiction. And addiction too, and how that is represented, has all kinds of clear indicators of very racist and certain kinds of sort of moral sensibilities that are very discriminatory, if not worse.
I was
drug people who are using drugs. Sorry, go ahead.
See, I was going to add a different dimension to this, so to speak, which is that everything that everybody said is very interesting about kind of the racial and biopolitics of these substances. But I wanted to add kind of the threat, so to speak, of sudden enlightenment, shall we say, and how threatening that is for religious hierarchies. There were similar debates about this in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, whether sudden enlightenment is possible or if it always has to be gradual. And clearly, if you embrace a gradual approach, then you need all these institutions and all these structures and power structures, and you need religious people who have more authority, who are virtuosos and can assist other people as they move along towards this state outside of language or this mystical state. But clearly, certainly there are what we would call religious traditions that believe that you can consume these substances and suddenly have the mystical experience. What a huge threat for Catholicism in South America, where you don't need a priest anymore if you've got somebody who could just eat some psilocybin and kabam, they're seeing whatever they need to see. So it's when we think about the legality of some of these, and kind of the anxiety in the religious organized institutional religions, it's because of the what could possibly that these substances could make religions unnecessary.
Given his, I'm cautious in how I use Terence McKenna when I quote him. But he made an argument that one of the chief hangups with psychedelics is that it's the Calvinist dictum that there's no free lunches. If you can get that enlightenment immediately, it's cheating. Like, it has to be hard. You have to work for it. If you didn't work for it, if it didn't take a long time to get there, it doesn't really count. And maybe like going the complete opposite direction, we might think also about the emphasis on rationality as part of what it is to be a good person or properly religious. So if reason and rationality are these kinds of Protestant pieces embedded in our culture, that this is how you think, it has to be logical, it has to be orderly. I mean, some of these psychoactive substances really don't work well for that kind of an argument. I mean, it's in many ways embracing chaos as a kind of enlightenment, or if you're going in with, and I know y'all have expressed you don't love the word entheogens. I tend to actually use it. I think if we're going into the category of entheogens, you're kind of looking for what you don't know, right? You're not looking to build a rational argument. In many ways, it's exploring what is out there. It's looking for that enlightenment that isn't already something you possess. That doesn't necessarily fit with the kind of logic or ration as an ideological structure that we've been given to work with. I don't know. I'm throwing that out there. I'm also shooting from the hip, so you can disagree with me.
I love it. It sounds great. And I, of course, although, yeah, you're talking about psychedelics as a sort of the class that seems especially dangerous to the existing order and whatever. You can think of other psychoactives that maybe help drive the existing order, like coffee, which, you know, doesn't have these kinds of concerns or restrictions, at least in contemporary modern culture. Not the case in medieval Islam and the Sufis, and thinking about coffee. So alcohol, maybe tobacco as well. These are much more willingly integrated in ways that, you know, again, in the thinking of the more macro level you're talking about, sort of wonder, are they integrated because they help fuel the machine or something like that? Maybe.
I was just going to add that I was thinking about, like, Andrew, your use of the word, rational and all of this. And, I think that at least in some of the Indian Buddhist context, the goal is to move beyond the rational and move beyond this. And so I was just teaching Nagarjuna last week to my class, and using language to get outside of language, using logic to show that logic makes no sense. So maybe in the Christian context, there's an anxiety about this space outside of logic or space outside of language. But without a doubt, in the Indian philosophical context, this is really just a wonderful thing. So it might very well be that there's a greater threat in a Christian context because of this state, the threat of ineffability, shall we say, which would leave you speechless. But anyway, it is something to wonder about, the distinction between the kind of Christian philosophy of religion and the attempt in, say, Madhyamaka Buddhism to use logic and philosophy to do away with logic and philosophy.
I'd like to ask one final question, get some quick answers on it before we go to the questions, if that's okay. When you study, or at least when I study, psychedelics or entheogens or whatever term we'd like to use, issues of BIPOC rights, LGBTQ voices, indigenous rights, et cetera, are pretty ubiquitous. So my question is, how does the religious use of psychoactive substances raise issues related to indigenous rights or reciprocity and issues related to BIPOC and LGBTQ voices?
Oh, I can
That's
answer.
about an hour-long answer that I'm asking that we could give. So keep in mind that we have just a few minutes here.
If I could just say, I was just reading this book here a couple of days ago. Very interesting for people who are curious. And I mean, clearly, for in the religious contexts, there's many cases where religions imagine queer worlds to be antithetical. And as you probably know, that some of the early LSD kind of application sometimes was for conversion therapy for people who are LGBTQ. So there's a real kind of danger, and this still happens. I think in France it's still happening. But so there's a really interesting kind of danger to the LGBTQ community with regarding psychedelics and how psychedelics could be used as a kind of a blunt weapon against them in these kind of contexts. So that's one answer, and one answer to that question, I think.
There's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot that obviously that can be said here, but you know, on the one hand, the flip side of that is to really emphasize and you know, really kind of focus on the fact that the main narrative around psychedelics, entheogens, drugs is white and male. So, you know, thinking through the construction of that narrative, and again, what are the cultural implications of it, is, I think, an important step. The other side is to really try to bring up the variety of different subcultures that are tied into psychedelics and that are, you know, operating in a very different kind of setting, cultural context, that is more empowering and maybe not so focused on individual kind of therapeutic interventions, but has to do with sort of more notions of collective trauma and so on. In my course just last week, we looked at Black psychedelia as a sort of subculture in art and music, and you know, there's just so much rich material there. Again, that brings us away from the main narrative. So there's that's another piece, I think, strand that has to be incorporated to really do justice to our topic.
I think there's maybe two different things I would add here, both kind of historical. One, if I'm thinking about peyote again, the kind of legal attempts to prohibit it. It's kind of a free-for-all before we get those legal interventions. But once it becomes clear that the federal government is gearing up to add this to the stuff that is off limits, people start to consolidate peyote into the Native American church. Like, the consolidation of this is in many ways a strategic effort. It's successful. Like, they actually, this works for the survival of peyote religion in some ways. But we end up with a kind of institutionalization that may not have happened had it not been for this kind of assimilationist agenda that the government had. I'm also thinking here about the ways that this can also be a kind of, I'm going back to the question of rationality as a kind of arbiter of who's okay and who's not. Because I'm thinking here about Rastafarians in the early days, and I'm blanking on the name, but there is somebody in probably the 1930s in Jamaica who is advocating for Rastafarianism, which has quite a bit of, you know, religious substance use. And the way that the British Crown deals with this is to say, look at what he's arguing for, look at what he's advocating, this guy's crazy. They put him in an asylum because he publishes this book in favor of Rastafarianism, arguing in one small piece about, you know, substance use as a valid thing, as a kind of liberation. So in thinking about the kind of colonial aspects to this, I mean, that's just intrinsically tied to race, I think. And I know you said we were short on time, so I'm going to pause myself here, Brad.
Well, thank you. We will turn it over to the questions here, to the audience, that is. We have a question. I think, Gary, or you've at least weighed in on this, but let's put it on the board here, so to speak. Someone's acknowledging the problematic aspect of the term entheogens, but because religious use of substance can extend beyond psychedelics, do you have a preferred term to the word entheogen that can encompass the religious use of substances beyond psychedelics? I think, Gary, you just said you prefer the word drugs, yeah?
I'll get this eventually. Yeah, just drugs. I mean, let's not complicate it, and let's not get near theology. Let's just talk about psychoactive substances and the fact that some, not all, can be religious at some times. So, I would also want to stay away from blanket statements about coffee is always religious to everybody.
If I can chime in on that for a second, I tend to use, in my research, I tend to use the phrase or the word psychoactive substances. I stay away from the word drugs because in my ethnographic work, I've been corrected so many times from people who are pretty offended by the word drugs because they don't want what they call their sacraments to be, in the same category as, something like crack or cocaine, which they would, consider you can't use for religious reasons. So curious, do you encounter that in your research where people are actually actively reject the word drugs?
I have, but that's okay.
Okay.
I mean, you can't please everybody. And again, crack, cocaine, heroin, I'm going there. I'm trying to say that these substances too can be religious. And again, and so I don't want to throw them into one kind of umbrella category that says, these are always religious. Another great book on drugs and heroin use and junkies is called Righteous Dope Fiend, which is an ethnography and visual photographic ethnography of the Mission District in San Francisco, people sort of living with the addicts in that community, and presents a totally different picture of morality, of values, of certain kinds of values that are operating within that. So, I don't want to make universal claims on anything. Drugs helps to kind of keep it, and I use psychoactive substances as well. But I'm okay if people aren't happy.
Right. It's interesting to note that that there are a few substances that people all kind of stipulate or state that they are without a doubt religious. And I'm thinking about Strassman and DMT and 5-MeO. And those, what is special about those that they really can't be anything else but religion or religious. So it's true that there are these that all of these substances could be religious, that they don't all have to be religious, but there are two substances that many people think are and indisputably religious. Just throwing it out there.
So we have one person.
Oh, go ahead.
Please, no, go.
No, I was going to jump in and say, if we're going that route, let's go back to coffee. I mean, every single church I've ever been at has a coffee thing after the start. I don't know if you can do church without coffee in 2023. It's there, right? At one point in time, people were trying to prohibit it, and it is a psychoactive substance.
Absolutely. And even just local coffee shops and how they operate. Again, a very deep, interesting history of coffee shops and the kind of threat that they used to pose, or what kinds of activities were imagined to take place there. And Starbucks, I don't know, but again, we can still think in religious ways, I think, about what that ritual means for people in our time.
So that actually might segue into one of the questions we have. Someone who's saying that for 5 years they've done hormone replacement therapy, and if I'm reading the question correctly, not explicitly for religious purposes, but it has been profoundly important in changing this person's religious life. So prescription drugs, which you mentioned earlier briefly, Gary, but something like hormone replacement therapy as something that impacts someone's religious life. Or coffee, it would be the well, not that that's prescription, but you get my point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of directions you can go in. I'm trying to pretty much stay centered around psychoactive substances, kind of sort of alterations of consciousness and mood to some degree. And there are a variety of different possibilities there. But even so, it speaks to something that's understudied, that there's some religious action that's going on in our relationship with our prescription pills and our pharmaceutical companies, however it's mediated through the healthcare system. I only know one book that looks at spirituality as it relates to antidepressants, written by a therapist that really, tries to entangle and disentangle those, the drug and the spiritual experience. And it's not just the argument that the psychopharmaceuticals enhance spirituality. It alters your relationship with your spirituality. For many people, it destroys their spiritual life. But again,
and I think in some ways what this question may be getting to is how much of our religious worlds are embodied. And to maybe address one of the other questions I saw in the Q&A, I'm not trying to steal that from you, Brad, but somebody asked about affect. And I'm wondering here, if we're thinking about what is it we're tracking with psychedelics, part of it is maybe like that kind of cognitive dimension, but everything here is also a felt embodied experience. And so maybe what the hormone question is addressing is that we're kind of talking about how do we pay attention to religion or spirituality when we're talking about maybe biochemistry? Like, isn't that kind of the shared component between these things?
Yeah, we did get a question. Is anyone using this field seems ripe for affect theory. So in addition to what Andrew asked, is anyone using affect theory?
Not for this. I mean, affect theory is one of those things that is just self-evidently relevant, but really hard to do as a historian. Unless you disagree, Gary.
No, I don't incorporate it as much. So I think, there's all kinds of great possibilities. And like you said, it's very, it's a natural to get beyond the cognitive, to think more, God, I'm not going to say holistically, but the emotions, mental, cognitive, spiritual, you're certainly trying to think of ways to see how all that bears on religious life, again, in our modern society where everyone is on drugs of some kind. What is that doing to our bodies, our states of mind? And yeah.
And maybe thinking about the possibility that students might be watching who may not have encountered affect theory before. Affect theory, for those who are listening, it's kind of the idea that there's something maybe intrinsic to how we experience emotion that is below the surface of emotion. So what we're calling emotion here may be like a construction of different affects. So we're talking here maybe about things like being startled or feeling, I'm blanking on a second one, but it's kind of this thing that is not quite emotion, but it's intrinsically unnameable. In some ways, it's kind of like mysticism in that way, but completely framed in terms of, I guess, allomedicine.
We have a few questions here about specific traditions. I think I'm getting a question about Murarescu's, if I'm saying that name correctly, the immortality key. We have a question about the use of psychedelics in early pagans or Greek pagan / early Christian tradition. We have another question about the use of psychedelics in the Mormon tradition. Someone recently proposed that, for people who aren't familiar with this debate, that Joseph Smith's early visions seem awfully psychedelic. And so some people have argued that Joseph Smith was on psychedelic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms. And I think there's been some there have been some pushback for obvious reasons, but for the sake of getting these questions on the table, does anyone want to address the argument in the immortality key or the chance that Joseph Smith was on psilocybin?
I'll jump on Joseph Smith real quick. I don't think Joseph Smith was on psilocybin. I think religious visions are a transcultural event that have been around since as long as we have written records. The idea that he may have been on psychedelics is just a way kind of to dismiss him as not really doing religion. That's kind of my argument.
It's interesting that some of the people I've studied who, I mean, I agree with you. I think the evidence does not support the theory that Joseph Smith took any psychedelic, including psilocybin. But for some of the people that I've studied, that actually legitimizes Mormons to them because they think, like they did, this sort of like proto-stoned ape theory, that their early religions, original religions, were based off psilocybin or psychedelic experience, and so therefore it does the opposite. It legitimizes Mormonism in their views. So it could be both ways, yeah.
I'm partly maybe reacting out of like disability studies as well, because the idea that, say, Muhammad was epileptic and that's really like the source of his visions, like that kind of argument comes up as a way to sort of overthrow the possibility that there may have been something valid to what he was doing. So I think partly I'm reacting to the question based on that. And I think you're right. Like, I'm not trying to dismiss the possibility that substance use could lead to religious experience. Just my immediate instinct when we start talking about somebody who's been marginalized, like Joseph Smith, is to think, okay, if this argument is coming up and there's no clear evidence for it, probably somebody's trying to dismiss him. Like, that's kind of my instinct.
So no one's tackling the immortality key, huh? We're going to leave that on the table.
Well, I mean, I don't know, it's a hugely important book in the psychedelic renaissance, and, tries to make an argument that has been percolating, before, about psychedelics and the early Christian church, and the spillover of the sort of Greco-Roman engagement with various psychoactive substances into, again, the earliest formation of the Christian church. And part of, I think, Murarescu's argument, as I understand it, is, well, like, maybe we should go back to that. We've got to reinvigorate the church. And so we've, in ways that are effective to people. And, so there, and I would also say, oh my God, it's in every freaking tradition. I mean, just confined Jews taking psychedelics. You can find Hindus, Buddhists, again, it's shouldn't be that surprising, but there is a great deal of interest within religious communities in the ways that cannabis can help you encounter the divine, or the history of wine in the Catholic Church. So, and then there have been, as you know, the stoned ape theory. There are all kinds of theories about Moses maybe being on some kind of psychedelics, connection between Jesus and psychedelics and mushrooms. So I think it's all very fascinating and rich, but there is, as you say, some questions around evidence.
These are all just functionalist analyses. We can't prove them, and they're nice and fun, speculative. And depending on your bias, you can draw one conclusion or the other. I want to throw this out just for fun here, is that it's interesting when we think about the use of these substances historically. Surely in the Hindu context, the Vedic priests were having soma and so on. And it's fascinating if we think about the current creation of allopathic guides as merely the contemporary version of a new kind of priest, who is now part of the allopathic religious tradition, which has all kinds of great ideas about what the body should do, and finitude and ideal life and citizenship and so on. I think Foucault, of course, has argued this in Birth of the Clinic in a funny sort of way. So now we have the creation of new guides, who are now the psychedelic guides, who are going to give you therapy in the allopathic context, paid for by your insurance company, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting replacement of one paradigm with another. And we imagine that this new paradigm is radically different, but it's really not that different.
And the idea that maybe health can be a way to police what other people are doing too, right? Don't use substances because they're bad for you. Like it's this way to maybe, yeah, I don't quite know if I'm going further than where I've gone. Like the idea that you are intervening in somebody's health for their benefit if you prohibit them from having substances becomes this kind of, one, a little bit of paternalism, but also, I'm thinking here about the way that people sometimes feel entitled to criticize somebody's weight because it's for their benefit, right? You're just speaking to their health. It's really just a way to kind of be an ass. Like that's like it's an excuse. Like, I'm sorry, did I go too far there? Like the way that you can critique somebody else's choices or the way that they're a person or whatever you want to say here, as long as you can make it about health, you can pretty much just say whatever you want.
I was going to twist that a little bit further, and is that when I think that these substances are dangerous in a kind of lock on toleration sort of phenomenon, is that they threaten the stability of the state, which is of course why Nixon did his Schedule 1 nonsense. And I think that the allopathic community is above all a kind of an attempt to create some metrics of normal and stability and a template for normality. And these substances, unless they're controlled in the setting of the allopathic context, will still threaten the stability of the state, which is why it's interesting that you have that although religion is going to play a role in people's psychedelic experiences, even in the allopathic context, they're not that trained to reply to that, and it's a threat and so on. And it's interesting too that, and I'm looking here at a question that somebody asked, I think it's Court Christak here, about these altered states of consciousness and how they were understood in the context of anesthesia. And what did people, and you don't see too much conversation about that, but an anesthesiologist can tell you about what those experiences are like. Gary, you were going to say something?
Oh God, I'm always going to say something.
Tell us, Gary.
Yeah, no, I don't, I got to hold back here. Great stuff.
Great stuff.
I was thinking just about morphine and end-of-life stuff. Thinking about the sort of biomedicine history and the new shamanism. I can't believe I'm going to plug myself, but I wrote this article called The Cult of Doctors that looks at the religious culture of this sort of early biomedical transition into the early 20th century, which has all kinds of interesting components at the micro and macro level as well. So and the notion that especially that what we're seeing happening today is like something like a psychedelic industrial complex being created. I thought of that earlier. But that also it is a kind of carryover of a certain shamanic structure in some ways, and thinking about the importance of guides and the training that they have to go through. And I love the debates around whether or not someone can be effective in these therapeutic sessions if they haven't tripped. So there are many, as I've said, directions to go in terms of these topics.
Right. No, it's true. It's funny. I think about ketamine therapy, and now you can do this ketamine therapy like around the corner, right? The anesthesiologist will give you 4 hours of it, but they won't. But they're not going to prep you for what potential experiences you're going to have. But in this connection, there's been another kind of creation of another kind of healthcare industry of people who are therapists who do pre and post integration work. So like pre-work here, I'll prep you for the ketamine trip that you're going to have when you go see the anesthesiologist. You have it, and then you have to have the post-integrative experience to make sense of whatever the anesthesiologist couldn't make sense for you in the first place. It is very interesting.
I mean, therapy is one of those places too where I think that the split between medicine and religion is really unclear, even if we're not talking about psychedelics. I mean, this is anecdotal. I went to see somebody for the first time a couple of years ago, and this therapist insisted that my problems were really spiritual in nature and would not allow me to think of it in a different way, and handed me a book with Deepak Chopra on it and said, this is like, I left that session early. We did not work out as a pair. But that idea, right, that it's supposed to be medicine, or it's supposed to be spiritual, doesn't even work anymore, I think, for something as basic as what's the nature of your, I don't know, your psyche. And how many universities are using spirituality as a kind of like, not an agenda, that's too loaded of a term, but what's what I'm looking for? It's not a cause either, an offering. Like, you can go to most universities, I think, and there's some kind of programming around spirituality. This is something that we're offering, whether it's state institution or private. I feel like that's become a central part of most higher ed. I don't know that would have happened 50 years ago.
Right, but it's all about the sort of spiritual but not religious. The nuns, it's the ways in which so much has changed, over the last 50 years or so, but certainly the unmooring of spirituality so that it really exists everywhere and nowhere, or here or there, is being, you can feel that very tangibly if you study religion and see the various ways in which it is deployed. And again, not just for neutral purposes that have to do with, trying to make you feel better necessarily, but that are part of this larger, cultural moment we're in, which speaks to the drugs as well as our salvation, because it ain't coming from the church or the temple.
And some of the work I'm doing here in Cleveland is I'm on a study where we're looking at the non-allopathic use of psychedelic drugs in Northeast Ohio, and so much of that world that I've been interviewing and observing are spiritual but not religious scenes, but interestingly organized. But there's no question that these psychedelic drugs might be threatening to organized religions, but they are embraced by these new religious movements, absolutely embraced. And it's really fascinating. This one that I've been observing very, very closely, imagines or examines or embraces the substances as medicines. And then after someone goes through some therapy, then it's expected or understood if they have a spiritual experience rather than a therapeutic one in the same way. So it's fascinating to see how these worlds are really embracing these substances and see them as entheogens, see them as medicines, see them therapeutically, and refer to them in all three ways in their rituals. So it's an interesting moment for sure.
It looks like we are on the edge of running out of time. So I would like to thank the panelists for your time today. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining and for your insightful questions. We would like everyone to offer their feedback, and we'd like to encourage everyone to join us for next month's conversation. Thank you very much.